was more of the swamp dwelling, the voodoo-esque aesthetic. Something very similar to Maldumba. One of the biggest rules for this that I like to enforce is very simply, you can't see it up there, but before I started, I made a quick set of like 4 bullet points to really help insinuate what the race is and why the aesthetic is going to be the way it is. It really helps you keep on track, and I found it much better than just winging it with no guidance whatsoever. No, this first one was one I actually really quite enjoyed. It's not my favorite of the bunch because it's a bit generic in the end, but I really enjoy the way it came out. And in its own weird way, the genericness of the design is part of why I like it. I actually went against this weird swirly, a pseudo mustache design because I realized it looked kind of silly. And here you see I'm actually having some issue with symmetry. Symmetry is a new feature they add in Photoshop, and I actually really like it. But if you're going to do anything with symmetry, remember that the symmetry lines always spawn in the middle. Right there you can see a bit better of what's going on. And there I am testing. I'm like, oh wait. This is all post-production recording. If you guys prefer, I can do the next episode on a live recording instead. But I figured this would be better than just me rambling about what I'm doing for 2 hours straight. And I will be editing this down, so it's not that long. But you can see I have the symmetry set up. And it's a really cool function. I really like it. It allows making concept work like this really easily. I'm just gonna sit here and watch now until something else happens that's worth mentioning. And for that period when I'm not discussing stuff like that, I will be speeding up the visual so it's not so long. Now this one was actually really interesting because I actually did a lot of edits to this main mask structure I'm doing right now with the lines, because I ended up not liking the way those 2 lines went around the face. It made it all look too helmet-like. It didn't look like a mask anymore. Now that the mask is finished, I ended up adjusting it ever so slightly to give it a little bit more of a symmetrical mask-like look, such as removing the lines like I mentioned earlier, because the helmet look did not work well for the aesthetic I was going for. And then I just ran a line a bit further up the middle to make it look like it wrapped around the face some. I fixed the eye up a bit. And then I added 2 bands around each of the horns. Now after that, and as you'll start to see here, I got this idea of making the Tal'Hyki skin plated. Like plated slightly, but the way it does is it twists and turns on itself, and it makes it look like they're made out of wicker. And I thought that was a really cool effect, and gave them a bit more of a unique flair than your average witch doctor, troll, or even human. Some of those super silent bits are actually from the program having a bit of trouble. OBS was interfering with it. I might look into getting something else like Shadowplay to record instead, because I really didn't like how much OBS was causing performance issues, especially with zooming in and out. As you can see there, I didn't really mean to zoom in. I just had to kind of work with it. Now, for the clothes, I had quite a few different ideas, and you'll see all of them really illustrated well throughout the sketches. But this one follows a leaf-like pattern with a bit of fur and wood, but the primary composition of the clothing is leaves. And I thought that was a nice extra touch. A tip I'd actually give to a lot of people, especially when it comes to designing characters and aesthetics, don't be afraid to be asymmetrical. A lot of people get really worried that if they don't make something look symmetrical, it won't look good. And if you do it right, you'll find it's quite the contrary. A lot of times, asymmetrical designs can look a lot better than purely symmetrical ones. Of course, there are things you do want to be symmetrical, like his mask, but you shouldn't force yourself to do symmetry if the design does not call for it. Now, the next two designs I actually ended up not liking as much. And you'll see the reason for that why in just a minute. With this first one here, I wanted to give it a more square mask design, but that didn't work nearly as well as I figured it would. And so, you're going to see a lot of me sketching around, a lot of rotation, nothing really coming of all the efforts. Probably delete the main layer a couple times simply because nothing was working right. Then I got this idea for a skull or almost slate-like mask. But in the end, I figured that one was a bit too hostile looking for the design. It looked like something like a gang of wild mini Ents or something would wear, and I didn't end up liking it that much. Here I had a very clear idea of doing some scale-like clothing, assuming they had like some sort of swamp dragons or whatever and where they live, and figured maybe they'd use their scales for clothing. I ended up not liking this idea as much, and you can see here I even goof up a bit with the pattern. You can see here I'm actually comparing the two to kind of get a feel. I start working on his skin. In hindsight, that design isn't absolutely terrible. I just didn't like in comparison to the other ones. Now, one I particularly don't like is this upcoming one. I had the idea for a spider mask. First, I tried doing a stone one, like a stone beak type of thing, but I ended up not liking that one at all. You can see here I'm trying to make it work. I'm locking the previous layer so I don't make the mistake of drawing on it again. But just, it's not working at all. It's really just not worth my time. And so, I'm here just going at it. Even the shape was weird. It looked like the bottom half was knocked off or something. I tried to redeem it with an interesting eyepiece, but that just further caused complications. Sometimes you really just have to ditch an idea and try again. Sometimes, when doing structures like this, and in characters in general, one of my actual favorite places to start with is the face. I think if you start off with your character's face, instead of necessarily trying to do the outlines first, it ends up coming across to you a lot more naturally. And you end up just having an easier time with it because you're not trying to cram their face into this preset box you've made. Rather, you're putting a box around the face you've made. And this is the spider design that I ended up not going with. This was simply a case of too many details. Like, I tried to separate too much from the design, and the design itself ended up hurting because of it. I still think the eye holes look like nostrils. Here's where the clothing got a little weird. I decided to go with a full cloth garb around the individual and then cover it in a spider web pattern to really drive home the spider theming. And I even went with like off the wall shapes there. Like the first one was a diamond, and then I went with a circle for both. And I won't lie, I ended up really liking how the spider webs looked, but not for this aesthetic. The aesthetic just does not work well with spider theming. Maybe for an off-brand like cult group of them, but not for their main aesthetic. Here's a design you'll see me repeatedly using through multiple sketches, which is the pseudo toga design. I actually really enjoy it for the aesthetic I was making. It has a nice, simplistic, almost tribal feel to it, which works really well. And you can see here I'm trying really hard to actually make the spider thing work, but take this as a lesson. Sometimes it's just better to cut your losses and try again than to struggle to try and make something that's just not working into something that'll work. I tried adding more layers, desperate to figure out some way to fix this little preliminary sketch from looking completely out there and offbeat, and I just couldn't. I tried doing this weird superhero visor, which just made the eyes even harder to discrete from the rest of him. I tried outlining it, which just kind of made the spider look like he had a mustache. So out of all of them, that's probably the design I found the most egregious throughout my sketch phase. But I think it's actually very important to get those egregious, albeit sometimes completely stupid and moronic designs out there, because when you do, it reduces the chance of you ending up taking something like that and not noticing until it's too soon. Now, this is a design I want to talk about in particular, because while making the next so many designs, I was listening to parts of the Hollow Knight soundtrack, and I looked at the Hollow Knight himself, some of the promotional art, and I thought that would make a really cool mask. There's going to be another Hollow Knight themed mask in here, but the reason I left these in and then just kind of do as a joke and then delete them and keep them out of the recording is I do want to emphasize you can take things that you like. You can take either singular aspects and make them into singular aspects, or like I've done a couple times with my world building, singular aspects and make them into entire species, as long as you're derivative enough. As long as you do not infringe upon the trade rights and the trademarks of others, you can do what you want. This is a really prime example of that. It's not infringing upon any rights whatsoever. I haven't taken the straight up design of Hollow Knight. I've taken that general bug horned aesthetic, and even with the empty big eyes, and then went on and continued to make it my own. As I said, you will be seeing another Hollow Knight themed mask, one that's a bit more obvious, but still a very nice design and one that I particularly enjoyed making. There I tried to flatten the mask out, but I didn't like it. Here I'm just testing out details and shape and whatnot to see if I can add anything. I ended up signing against it and just keeping with the mask the way it was, before adding some layered fabric as a means of clothing, like some tattered layered fabric. Don't let anyone, when it comes to your creative work, yell at you about how you stole from them. You stole their idea, because you cannot copyright ideas. You can trademark your execution of them. You can copyright your execution of them in certain cases, but you cannot copyright an idea. You cannot own an idea. Do not let people try to fool you otherwise. Execution and intent is more important than the idea will ever be. Now, if I were making these designs specifically to deceive would-be purchasers of Hollow Knight or Hollow Knight related media and merchandise to sell my own product, that would be infringing upon Hollow Knight's trademark. But I'm not. I have taken something from Hollow Knight that I particularly enjoy. I haven't played a game, but I have a friend who plays a lot of it, and the aesthetic is really cool. I love the art in that game. But I've taken something from something I enjoy, and you'll see a lot of it in this series, and I have made it into something of my own. Of course, there are caveats to this, such as, tracing or art theft, but that's a different beast altogether. That gets into malicious territory. And even then, I don't necessarily mind tracing as long as you are, again, very derivative with it. If you have a pose you particularly like, I don't necessarily mind the tracing aspect, as long as you aren't just tracing it because you can't draw, but if you're tracing out like the skeletal structure or whatever, so you can make a pose or a similar pose for your own work, I think that's personally okay. but I don't ever condone just outright tracing or outright stealing artwork. With the Hollow Knight one done, I began the second one of the pair of Hollow Knight inspired designs, this one being primarily inspired by Grimm from the Gods and Nightmares DLC. Now, Grimm is a design I actually really enjoy. I think he has a really fun design, and you can actually see here in the base sketch for concept, I originally gave it a couple of fangs to try and differentiate it a bit more, because I was worried of it looking a bit too samey, but I ended up not liking it. The horns I ended up struggling with quite a bit, just because they're really odd. I started out with like really small ones, and that didn't look right. In hindsight, the fangs really off-put the picture more than the horns ever did. It's at this point I was realizing that I had accidentally missed a couple of pieces that really solidified the design, being the little widow's peak and the color of the horns. So I start filling that in, and the design starts working a lot better. And you can see here a few times I try to redeem the fangs, and again, it's just a case where you've got to learn to let go sometimes. I should have just erased them all together, rounded off the mask, and continued going. It looks kind of like a brain without proper context. Kind of spooky. Now we're working on the cloak, and I love cloak designs like Grimm's. I like the big neck guards. Really good stuff. I really particularly enjoy it. So you started out with the neck bit, and then we did that more wild and crazy tattered look. Now the final design here is actually one of my favorites, simply because of how off the wall it is, and that's the one eye mask. And at first I didn't start out with it. I tried to do something different. Tried to give it a slightly more normal looking mask with some simple dots and whatnot. So I ended up scrapping that idea altogether and tried a few more ideas. Namely a bird skull or a plague doctor style mask. But I didn't like that one either. I'm not even sure what I was trying for there, I'll be honest. that was originally going to be a skull-like pattern, but then I just got the idea of giving it a couple of horns and making it asymmetrical. And so you have the design that we ended up finishing off with, which is one I really enjoy. And then we got the intricate patterns that are applied to the mask, like a painting. Now we have all 6 preliminary sketches done. I begin with a stark red and a stark green, and I sit down and I think of what aspects I like in all the masks and all the designs I did. By taking this greenish color I had and setting everything up, I began to simply encircle or mark areas I enjoyed with green and areas I didn't with red. Now that decisions were made, I took all of them and created some refined sketches, which you'll see at the end of this cut. Okay, so we're back with the colors, and it's actually another day I slept between editing. But I don't have actually that much to talk about when it comes to the coloring itself, but I do have a lot to talk about when it comes to the finished colors and designs, and it'll be much easier to explain the thought process and all that stuff just by looking at the finalized designs and explain the color choices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my voice right here and just let the video play through it like at really high speed, and then come back to you guys when all of them are colored in and discuss the coloring it as the whole thing is finished. So now we're at the finished product, and I've pulled up the original file just so we can all look over it, and I've given each color set a distinction, 1A and 1B to 4A and 4B respectively. And what I want to talk about now is specifically, this is going to be where I get to nerd out a bit more. I want to talk about the importance of color and aesthetic. So one of the biggest things you must consider when creating an aesthetic for a race or a culture is where are they found? Where are they commonly found? And of course, things with like magic and technology, you can kind of ignore it. But if you're just doing a general fantasy setting, even if you're doing a high-tech setting, you're still going to want to think about this because it'll be a lot more pleasing to the eye if the aesthetic of the clothing and coloring of the people living in this area match the area itself. So in this case, the Tal'Hyki live in swamps and marshes, so there's a lot of natural greens and yellows and grays. There's some fur and some browns. There's a bit of a stone with 4A. There's that really nice full wood mask with 1A. You have the nice painted mask of 3B. All of these are really important for setting up that marshland bog style. And that's actually why I'm not that big of a fan of 2A, the more grim style appearance to the, grim themed aesthetic I went for. I think 2B handles the aesthetic perfectly. It looks really good. I really like that one. But 2A, not so much. And I feel like the same issue is with 4A and 4B. I feel 4A is really, really nice, and it really fits that marshland aesthetic. But 2B is a bit too harsh. It would fit well with a canyon or a desert, an arid climate, better than it does a humid climate. And this goes for anything. If you're doing dwarves in a tundra, you don't want the dwarves to be wearing, pink and blue, and they're going to be wearing more muted colors, your blacks, your grays, your browns, because those soak up heat, and they keep them warm. And, you're gonna have white. You're gonna want to have white for the fur because all the animals there are gonna be camouflaged to fit the snow. And you might find, occasionally dyed colors like red and blue and purple, but those would solely be for aesthetic purposes. Like, they would be intentionally dyeing them for the aesthetic, for like royalty or the guard, nobility, mages. They'd be doing it for specific reasons in universe. When it comes to just getting a natural feel going, you want to try and avoid colors that stray away too harshly from the climate's aesthetic. In this case, again, since it's marshlands and swamplands, it's a lot of deep browns and grays and greens. But that should be the end of this episode. I'm sorry that I couldn't really nerd out that much, but when you're just starting off, there's not much to nerd out about. The next time you see me, I'll be going over taking all 8 of these guys and giving them full-on attire, full clothing and outfits. And that's going to be really fun. You're going to get to see me nerd out a lot more with that than this one. I I nerded out more about copyright than I did actual aesthetic here because there wasn't much for me to nerd out over. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you next time.